The Galactic Union had existed for 11,000 years before humanity found it, and in all that time, it had never once considered that silence could be a weapon. This was understandable. The Union was built on telepathy, not the gentle, barely there mental nudges of science fiction novels humans had written about for centuries before they ever left their atmosphere, but full, rich, layered communion. When a Velhari diplomat thought something, the Ethon sitting across from them felt it. When a Miru elder composed a formal treaty argument, every being in the chamber experienced the logic of it as a coherent emotional architecture, something between music and mathematics, every premise clicking into place with the satisfying weight of a key finding its lock. Communication in the Union was not a thing that happened between minds. It was a thing that happened across them all at once, the way a chord happens across strings. To be a member of the Galactic Union was to be, in the most literal sense, never truly alone. They sent a welcoming committee for humanity, as they always did. 11 species were represented. 3 Velhari, their crystalline skin refracting the station's light into soft, prismatic arcs. 2 great Ethon elders, their spider-limbed bodies folded into the polite stillness of formal greeting. A pair of Keth translators, their 3-lobed brains uniquely suited to bridging psychic dialects. And 4 junior diplomatic attachés from various other member species, all chosen specifically because they were, by Union standards, psychically resilient. The welcoming committee was selected the way you'd select a team for any demanding environment. Send the ones who can handle the conditions. The conditions they had anticipated: alien mind structure, unfamiliar psychic texture, the usual mild disorientation of encountering a species whose internal architecture did not map neatly onto Union norms. They had not anticipated Commander Yara Osei. She came aboard the welcoming station, Nexus Threshold 7, the Union's designated first contact facility, built specifically to receive new species and shepherd them into the formal process of Union membership, with a delegation of 9 humans. She was a tall Ghanaian woman in her early 40s, career UN diplomatic corps, with close-cropped natural hair and the particular bearing of someone who had spent so many years in rooms where she was the only person of her kind that she had simply stopped noticing it. Behind her walked Lieutenant Dex Callahan, her security lead, a quiet, broad-shouldered man from rural Idaho, who communicated primarily in nods and had the psychic signature, as the Velhari would later describe it, of a granite cliff considering whether to fall. Behind him, 7 other humans, aides, translators, analysts, a young xenobiologist named Dr. Priya Mehta, who had been vibrating with excitement for the entire 3-week transit and could not stop thinking about the protein structures of alien cellular biology, a fact that would become relevant very shortly. Psionic analyst Miru was the first to make contact. This was standard protocol. Miru was young, barely a century old by Velhari reckoning, which made her something like a promising graduate student, and had been assigned to the welcoming committee specifically because her psionic sensitivity was exceptional and her shielding was robust. Her job was simple: make first psychic contact with the incoming species, establish baseline mental texture, and report to the committee chair so that appropriate accommodations could be arranged. She reached out with a careful, practiced extension of her awareness, the psychic equivalent of a handshake, gentle and clearly intentional, toward the human delegation as they crossed the docking threshold. What happened next would be discussed, dissected, formally investigated, informally argued about over beverages, and eventually written into the founding documentation of the Union's Psionic Safety Accords, under the heading, The Threshold Event, Sol 3 Contact, Year 11,147. The experience Miru later described, and she was remarkably coherent about it, given that she spent the subsequent 4 hours in the station's medical bay with what the attending physician characterized as a psychic concussion, was not one of encountering an alien mind. It was one of encountering many minds simultaneously, none of which were distinguishable from each other, all of which were operating at a register that Miru's training had simply never prepared her for. It was not like touching a mind, she said afterward, her crystalline skin dimmed to the pale gray of someone running on emergency resources. It was like standing inside a waterfall. Not a gentle waterfall. One of those planetary ones where the water falls from such height that the impact is enough to kill something. Every single one of them was thinking. Not communicating, just thinking, privately, to themselves, all at the same time. Each thought generating subtexts and counter-thoughts and emotional reverberations and memories and associations, and half-formed impulses and involuntary reactions to the room, and the light and the temperature and the smell of the recycled air, and the way their own clothing felt against their skin, and it was all happening at once, layered and simultaneous and completely unstructured, and none of them were even trying to project it. They were just existing, just standing there walking forward across a docking threshold, and their minds were— She paused, and her translator collar struggled for a moment with what came next. Loud, she finally said. They were so impossibly, catastrophically, beautifully loud. The other members of the welcoming committee had felt it too, though with varying degrees of impact, determined by their own psionic sensitivity. The two Ethon elders had managed to maintain their composure, which was a significant testament to their age and experience. A lesser telepath would have been on the floor. One of the Keth translators had involuntarily seized, a brief neurological event that resolved itself within seconds, but left him with a persistent ringing in his middle cortex for the following week. The junior attachés had mostly managed a range of responses from mild dizziness to a complete and dignified evacuation of the room that they would later claim was a scheduled security sweep. The humans had no idea any of this was happening. Commander Ose had crossed the threshold with her hand extended for a handshake, the human greeting gesture that the Union's cultural briefing had flagged as significant, a physical contact ritual implying trust, and found herself standing in front of a welcoming committee that had, in the span of approximately 3 seconds, experienced something between severe motion sickness and an orchestra of 1,000 instruments all playing different pieces at full volume simultaneously, and was now doing its diplomatic best to remain upright. Ambassador Thessali, Ose said, addressing the committee chair, a senior Velhari diplomat whose crystalline surface was doing something complicated that the briefing had not prepared her for. It's an honor to be here. On behalf of the United Earth delegation, Yes, Ambassador Thessali said, with the specific carefulness of someone managing several things at once. Yes. Welcome. Please. Sit. Immediately. Please sit down, and if possible begin speaking out loud immediately, and do not under any circumstances stop. Osi sat. Her delegation sat. Dr. Maida, still vibrating with excitement, began describing the cellular structure of the appetizers visible on the reception table. Lieutenant Callahan sat beside her and said nothing. Miru, who had by this point been guided to a seat of her own, later recorded in her official report that the moment Lieutenant Callahan sat down and went quiet, the moment one human mind in that room went still in its thinking, no longer projecting the constant chaotic waterfall of human consciousness, but instead settling into the specific focused silence of a professional who was watching a room for threats and not thinking about anything except the room, was the single most frightening thing she had encountered in her century of life. The others were a storm, she wrote. Loud, chaotic, unpredictable, but the storm of weather, random, directionless, a natural phenomenon. The quiet one was something different. When he stopped thinking in that broad, scattered human way and started thinking in whatever it is a human does when they are alert and ready and completely focused, it was not silence. Silence, in psionic terms, is the absence of signal. What he produced was not absence. It was negative signal. It was the feeling of a void that was not empty, but full of something that had chosen not to be heard. It was the psychic equivalent of watching a very large animal stop moving in tall grass. The committee's debrief lasted 3 days. Humanity's formal entry into the Union was placed on emergency procedural hold pending a High Council review. The review would take 6 weeks. By the end of it, the Galactic Union would have done something it had never done for any species in 11,000 years of diplomatic history. It would make a law specifically about them. The High Council of the Galactic Union convened in full session for the first time in 300 years. This was notable. The council had 17 permanent members, representing the 17 founding species of the Union, and getting all 17 of them into the same physical space simultaneously required the sort of diplomatic scheduling that lesser civilizations would have found impressive and Union members found merely exhausting. The last full session had been called to address the Keth secession crisis, which had involved a border dispute, 3 fleets of warships, and the very real possibility of the first inter-Union war in recorded history. Before that, the session prior had been to formally admit the Ethon into the founding membership, an event so significant it now had its own holiday in 6 different calendar systems. The agenda for this session: 1 item, the matter of the Sol 3 species. High Consul Varanith called the session to order. She was old by any standard, an Ethon elder of the 6th generation, her spider-limbed body the deep amber of aged resin, her 8 eyes carrying the particular quality of light that happens when a conscious mind has been thinking for long enough that it starts to think about thinking itself. She had presided over the council for 400 years. She had seen species come and go, seen crises resolve themselves through patience that shorter-lived beings would have called impossible. She was, in the estimation of everyone who had ever worked with her, not a being who frightened easily. She was frightened now. Not obviously, not in any way that a human observer would have been able to read in her body language or expression, but the council members around her could feel it in the edges of her projected thought, the way you can feel a cold front in the air before the temperature actually drops. The Psionic Safety Division has completed its assessment, she said, and the Chamber's translation systems rendered her thought speech into the 17 primary languages of the member species simultaneously, a function so seamlessly integrated that most council members forgot it was happening. I will summarize. The full report is available for individual review in the council archive, and I recommend, specifically for our Velhari and Keth members, that you do not read it immediately before sleeping. There was a ripple of what would have been in a human chamber, quiet, nervous laughter. In a room full of telepaths, it was something more precise than that. A shared flicker of recognition that the old consul had made a joke, followed immediately by the shared understanding that the joke was covering something real. The Sol 3 species, humans, present a category of psionic environmental hazard that does not currently exist within our classification system, Varanith continued. The division recommends we create one. They have proposed the designation Class 7 Ambient Cognitive Hazard, defined as a species whose passive, involuntary mental activity generates psionic interference at a level sufficient to cause physiological distress in proximate telepathic beings without any intent, effort, or awareness on the part of the generating species. Class 7, said Council Member Arath Voss of the Keth, whose 3-lobed brain was still 3 weeks after the threshold event, generating a faint, intermittent tone that his physician could not fully explain. What are classes 1 through 6? There are no other classes, Varanith said. We created the scale starting at 7 to give ourselves room to classify anything worse, should it exist. The silence in the chamber, a real silence, the comfortable silence of minds at rest in familiar company, held for a long moment. The question before the council, Varanith said, is what to do about them. What followed was 8 hours of debate, and it was debate in the fullest sense. Not just words exchanged, but the full richness of telepathic argument, emotion and logic and instinct and experience, flowing between 17 ancient minds, with the unguarded honesty that comes from knowing that in this room, no one can pretend not to mean what they mean. It was, by any measure, one of the more extraordinary conversations in the Union's long history. The faction that wanted to simply deny humanity entry into the Union was initially larger than the one that did not. The arguments were not unreasonable. No species should be admitted to an organization whose members they could involuntarily harm. The Union had obligations to its current membership. Humanity had not yet demonstrated any awareness of the harm they were causing. And the threshold event had raised a secondary question, something the Psionic Safety Division's report had addressed in careful, measured language that nevertheless managed to convey a specific kind of institutional alarm. It was analyst Maru's observation that had prompted it. The section of the report dedicated to what she had recorded about Lieutenant Callahan's silence. The active human mind, the report noted, produces ambient psionic interference measurable as a grade 4 cognitive disruption field at a radius of approximately 3 meters, diminishing with distance. The intensity varies significantly based on emotional state, level of cognitive engagement, and individual variation, but remains consistently present during all normal waking states of consciousness. It cannot be suppressed or controlled by the human. They do not know they are producing it. The null state registers on psionic assessment equipment in a way that is difficult to describe in clinical terminology, but that multiple division analysts have independently characterized with the same intuitive phrase. It feels like being watched by something that you cannot see. It triggers a fear response in all tested telepathic subjects that is disproportionate to any rational threat assessment. It is, to be precise, more immediately frightening than the active mind noise despite being objectively less disruptive. The division has been unable to determine whether the null state is voluntary or involuntary. The human subject is not available for testing at this time. Council member Thesali, who had been in the room for the threshold event and had spent the intervening weeks reviewing the footage of the debriefing, with the obsessive attention of someone trying to understand something that had genuinely unsettled them, spoke quietly. "I have watched the recording of that moment 47 times, she said. The moment when the security officer stopped thinking loudly and started thinking quietly. And I have tried, with 47 viewings and 400 years of diplomatic experience, to determine whether what I saw in his face in that moment was intentional, whether he knew what he was doing to us." "And?" Baroneth asked. "I don't think he did," Thesali said. "Which is worse. I would much rather he had been doing it deliberately. A deliberate action can be negotiated with. A species that generates that quality of silence simply by paying attention." She stopped. "That is not something I know how to classify as anything other than a predator." The words sat in the chamber with the weight of something true being said for the first time. In the end, the argument that won the debate was not a strategic one. It was made by the youngest council member present, a third-generation Velhari named Council Shara Lin, who had been admitted to the council only 60 years ago, and who still, in the estimation of her senior colleagues, had the unfortunate habit of saying what she actually thought before considering whether it was politically useful. "They didn't know," Shara Lin said. "They have never known." They arrived with their hands extended for their greeting ritual, which their own cultural research tells me is a gesture they reserve for beings they want to trust. They stood in our welcoming chamber, and their minds were loud and chaotic and overwhelming, and it never occurred to them that this was possible, because they are a non-telepathic species, and they have spent their entire history not knowing that minds could touch each other at all. The harm they caused was real. It was also entirely innocent. "And I think," she said, "that what we decide to do with innocent harm says more about us than it does about them." The vote was 11-6. Humanity would be admitted, with conditions. The formal legislation was called the Psionic Safety and Species Accommodation Act, Amendment 7, and it was the first piece of Union law ever written specifically about a single species. In the Union's diplomatic language, a formal register that had been refined over 11 millennia to achieve a level of precision that human legal documents could only gesture toward, it ran to approximately 400 pages. The summary, translated into English, was considerably shorter. All human representatives operating within Union-designated spaces are required, during all waking hours in proximity to telepathic species members, to maintain a minimum level of verbal vocalization sufficient to prevent the onset of null state generation. In practical terms, keep talking. Sing if you prefer. Recite things. Tell stories. Narrate your activities. Maintain the ambient cognitive noise that your species naturally produces through language, as language appears to partially ground the otherwise unstructured output of the human consciousness into a form that telepathic species can process without injury. Under no circumstances are human representatives to remain verbally silent for periods exceeding 90 seconds in the presence of telepathic colleagues without prior notification and the provision of appropriate psionic shielding for all parties. The null state, the condition arising from a human entering a state of complete focused cognitive silence, is classified as a level 2 psionic hazard. Deliberate induction of the null state in the presence of unshielded telepathic beings is equivalent, under Union law, to the deployment of a Class 3 cognitive weapon. This legislation is passed with the full recognition that human beings cannot perceive these effects, do not produce them intentionally, and are not responsible for their existence. The mandated accommodations are not punitive. They are protective. They are, in the language of Union precedent, the telepathic equivalent of the safety equipment that many pre-Union species required when operating in environments with atmospheric compositions hazardous to others. In short, the human is not a weapon, but human silence is. Keep them talking. Commander Osei received the document aboard the return transit vessel and read it 3 times. Then she went to find Lieutenant Callahan, who was in the ship's small gymnasium, lifting what appeared to be a truly irresponsible amount of weight, in the specific silence that Callahan had maintained for most of the return journey. "Dex," she said. "Ma'am, I need you to read something." He set down the weight, carefully because he was, whatever else he was, professional, and took the tablet she offered. She watched him read. His face, as it always was when he was reading something, told her nothing. Lieutenant Callahan's face was an extremely well-maintained diplomatic fiction. She had once seen him read a threat assessment that began with the words, "Probability of survival, 12%, with the same expression he used for breakfast menus. He finished the document. He looked up. "So," he said, "I'm a hazard. Your silence is a hazard." "My silence. Your silence," she confirmed. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Huh," he said. And then, with the specific energy of a man who has just learned something about himself that he is going to need to sit with for a while, "Huh. You're going to have to narrate," Osei said. "Constantly, when you're on duty in Union spaces." He looked at her with an expression that was as close to alarm as Callahan's face was capable of producing. Narrate, talk, continuously, never stop talking. There was a pause. "Ma'am," Callahan said slowly, "I am from a town of 211 people. The main industry was cattle. I once went 3 weeks without a conversation longer than 4 words. I am not a narrating man." "You are now," Osei said. "Union law. The adjustment period, as Osei would later write in her official account of the first year of human-union relations, was not without its challenges. The human delegation's permanent quarters on Nexus Threshold 7 occupied the station's eastern residential wing, which the Union's housing committee had helpfully fitted with additional acoustic insulation, a gesture that was both practical. Some members found the human noise overwhelming even at distance, and slightly insulting in a way that the humans had decided not to be offended by, because there were larger diplomatic battles to choose. The requirements of the vocalization mandate created, in the first weeks, something that could generously be called creative compliance. The diplomatic aides developed their own strategies. One woman, a language specialist named Sophia Reyes, began reciting poetry. She had a significant memory for verse and worked her way alphabetically through human literary history at a relaxed pace that the Ethon staff found hauntingly beautiful, even filtered through translation, though they were puzzled by the content. The cultural attaché, a cheerful man named James Okafor, who was entirely unrelated to the commander and who had mentioned this so many times in the first week that it had become a running joke, narrated his administrative work in a low, continuous murmur that a Keth Jr. diplomat later described as the most soothing sound I have ever encountered, despite meaning nothing to me. Commander Osei herself had no difficulty talking. She had spent 30 years in rooms where people were trying not to listen to her, and had developed a fluid, unhurried verbal style that required almost no effort to sustain. She could maintain conversation for hours. She held briefings that her staff found exhausting, and alien colleagues found, to their own surprise, deeply comfortable to sit in. The ambient cognitive field generated by a human in mid-speech was, as the Psionic Safety Division had noted, significantly less disruptive than the unvoiced internal monologue. Something about the act of generating language seemed to organize the human mind's output in ways that made it more legible, less overwhelming. Not pleasant exactly, but manageable, predictable. something that telepathic senses could learn to hold at arm's length rather than be knocked over by. Lieutenant Callahan struggled. This was not a surprise to anyone who had met him. Callahan was a man of economy. He communicated what needed to be communicated and regarded surplus words as something between inefficiency and rudeness. His native mode of operation was the single-syllable response, the nod, the raised chin, the particular quality of stillness that people who grew up around large animals learn early because large animals notice movement and ignore stillness. He tried, in his systematic, methodical way, to comply. "Checking perimeter," he said, on his first patrol under the mandate. "Walking left. Wall is still where it was. Door is closed. Light above door is green, which I assume means what green means. Turning now. Still walking. Floor is..." He paused, considering this. Floor is floor-like. Miru, monitoring remotely as part of her liaison duties, recorded in her notes. Day 3, human Callahan compliance attempt. Technical compliance achieved. Psionic output suggests intense concentration on the requirement to speak, which generates a secondary field the division has not previously encountered. The psychic texture of a very determined man trying very hard to do something that does not come naturally to him. This is actually more disruptive than the baseline noise. Recommend alternative approach. She delivered this recommendation in person because she had found that humans responded better to direct conversation than to formal memos, a preference she found both inefficient and endearing. "You're trying to narrate the way you think a narrator narrates," she told him in the small security office he'd claimed as his working space. "That's why it's not working. You're monitoring your own speech instead of just producing it. The goal isn't performed speech. The goal is your actual mind, externalized." He looked at her for a moment. "So just say whatever I'm actually thinking, as much as possible." "Yes. That's not..." He started, then stopped. "I don't talk about what I'm thinking." "I know," Miru said. "Your species' relationship with interiority is fascinating. You all have this enormous, churning, incredibly complex inner life, and you treat it like a state secret. It's private. It's extremely private," she agreed. "That's part of what makes the noise so overwhelming. You're all thinking these enormous, complicated private thoughts, and then trying to present this calm exterior, and the gap between the two creates a kind of psychic..." She searched for a word. "Pressure. Like a sealed container with steam inside." Callahan looked at the ceiling for a moment. "And when the container stops making noise, it means the pressure has found somewhere else to go," Miru said. "And we can't tell where. And that is the part that frightens us." He was quiet for a moment, a brief silence measured by union law well within the 90-second limit. Then he said, in the careful flat tone of a man committing to something, "All right, I can do this." He paused. "I like coffee," he said. "I had coffee this morning. It was the best thing that's happened since we left Earth. I've been thinking about coffee for most of the patrol. I would commit a minor diplomatic incident for another cup. The lighting in this wing is slightly too blue, and I've been meaning to mention it. I counted 14 structural variations in this corridor that Earth military architecture would not approve of, and I would like to speak to your engineering division at some point about load-bearing considerations for..." Miru's monitoring instruments reported a clean, steady, organized psionic field. Disrupted, yes. Human loud, yes, but legible, structured, safe. "That," she said, "is exactly right." He made a sound that was not quite a sigh. "This is going to be a very long posting. 6 months into the human delegation's residence on Nexus Threshold 7, the Keth Auxiliary Fleet arrived unannounced at the station's outer marker. Not the Union-aligned Keth. The other ones. The political situation with the Keth Reformation movement was something that Osei had spent 3 weeks reading briefings about before their arrival at the station, and had come away from, with a working understanding that could be summarized as: the Keth had a civil war. It ended badly and inconclusively. One faction joined the Union, and the other faction decided that the Union was the problem, and occasionally they staged provocations to make this point. The provisioning station at Nexus 7 had been targeted before, twice in the last decade, both times as harassment rather than genuine assault, flyby weapons discharges that set off alarms and drove everyone to emergency stations and caused about 16,000 credits in hull damage and then went away. This time they stayed. 14 Keth Reformation vessels dropped from transit speed at the outer marker and held position, not attacking, not retreating, broadcasting on open channels a manifesto that the station's translation systems were rendering with increasing desperation because the Reformation Keth used a psychic dialect that the standard translators had not been updated for, and some of the nuance was being lost. The manifest content that came through was, the Union was corrupt, the threshold system was a tool of psychic oppression, the humans should not have been admitted, and the Reformation fleet was here to make a point. The station commander, a Velhari named Fleet Warden Thesavara, declared a defensive standby and requested Union fleet response. Union fleet response was 47 minutes away. 14 heavily armed vessels were 3 minutes away. The Reformation fleet fired. It was not an attempt to destroy the station. Osei understood this from the first impact. The shots were targeted at the station's communication arrays, its docking bay shields, its external sensor suite. They were trying to isolate the station, not level it. This was a siege, not an assault. Take the comm arrays, take the docking shields, hold the station hostage until the Union fleet arrived to negotiate. Use the negotiations to broadcast your grievances across the Union's communication network. It was, she thought, a reasonably well-planned political action. She said none of this out loud. The moment the first shot landed and the emergency lighting shifted to red, something happened to Commander Yara Osei that she was not aware of and had no words for. The part of her brain that had spent 30 years in crisis rooms, the part that had been built by evolution over 200,000 years of survival pressure, the part that an ancestral human standing on a dark plain had first developed when something moved in the grass nearby. That part engaged and everything else went quiet. Not quiet the way sleep is quiet. Quiet the way a held breath is quiet. In the corridor outside the security center, Miru felt it happen. She had been at her monitoring station when the alarm sounded, had done the standard Velhari response to sudden environmental threat, a brief crystalline clenching of her outer skin layer, a reflexive tightening of her psionic shielding, and had then begun the calm, practiced process of emergency protocol compliance. She was halfway through pulling up the station's damage report when the human field changed. Not went silent. Changed. The constant ambient noise of the 9-person human delegation, which she had over 6 months learned to read as fluently as any other environmental signal, the way you learn to hear rain as background rather than interruption, did not disappear. It reorganized. All 9 signatures, which had been their normal, scattered, chaotic, individualized streams of thought, converged. Not toward each other. They were not communicating telepathically, they couldn't. But toward the same point. The same quality of focus. The same sharpening. The same drawing in of peripheral cognitive scatter, as 9 human minds simultaneously shifted from people existing in a place to people with a problem to solve. The waterfall became a river. The river became a current. And at the center of it, the signal she had cataloged 6 months ago and never stopped being unnerved by. Lieutenant Callahan's field, which had gone fully, completely, deliberately, terrifyingly null. Miru put her hand on the wall to steady herself and activated her emergency comm. "This is Psionic Liaison Miru," she said, her voice carrying the careful steadiness of someone managing a fear response. "I need all telepathic station personnel to initiate Level 3 psionic shielding immediately. The human security team has entered operational mode." "Is that a hazard?" the station's emergency coordinator asked, because the emergency coordinator was new and had not been on the station 6 months ago. "It's—" Miru stopped. In her monitoring feed, she could see the human team moving through the station's corridor network with the fluid, coordinated efficiency of beings who had run this drill so many times it required no conscious thought. None of them were speaking. All of them were completely silent. Not the enforced, self-conscious silence of someone trying to comply with a law, the natural, absolute silence of professionals doing the thing they were most built to do. "It's not a hazard to us," she said. "Get the shielding up anyway." The Reformation Fleet's assault team boarded through the compromised docking bay shield. 23 Keth operatives in tactical gear, 3-lobed brains coordinated by a short-range group telepathy field that made them something like a hive tactical unit. Each operative knowing the position and status of every other, processing information collectively, moving with the eerie synchronization of a species whose military doctrine had been built around the assumption that you always knew what your allies were thinking. It was an extremely effective system against other telepathic species. They entered the docking bay in their coordinated formation and encountered Lieutenant Callahan, alone, in the dark. The bay lighting had gone out with the external sensor array. Emergency lighting ran along the floor at shin level, casting long shadows upward, turning everything into geometry. Callahan was standing in the shadow of a cargo transport, 20 meters from the bay door, and he had been standing there, completely motionless and completely silent, for the 40 seconds it had taken the boarding team to breach the lock. The lead Keth operative was a 7-year veteran of the Reformation Fleet's tactical division. She had 3-lobed tactical integration that had seen her through 11 border provocations and 2 genuine engagements. She was, by any professional measure, not a being who was unsteady in a crisis. She stepped through the bay door and her tactical integration registered the human, not by sight. The shadow was good enough that visual identification took a second longer. By psionic signature, the automatic background assessment that all telepathic tactical operators ran constantly, mapping the minds of everyone in their environment, friendly and hostile, the way a non-telepath might map a room with their eyes. The bay was empty. The psionic map said empty. 17 minds on the station, positions tracked, every staff member accounted for, 4 running, 3 sheltering, the rest in the administrative wing. The bay was empty. And then something in the bay moved, not physically. Nothing had moved physically. But the psionic field shifted in the way that happens when something that was not producing signal begins to, when a null space acknowledges that it contains something. It was not a mind. Or it was a mind the way a collapsed star is light. Something that had passed through its own event horizon and was now expressing itself in negative space, in the information carried by the absence of information, in the fear that floods the observer not because they have seen the thing, but because they have suddenly understood that the thing is there and has been there and knows they are looking. The lead operative stopped walking. Her tactical integration tried to process the signal and failed. There was a brief, catastrophic moment of confusion in the shared Keth tactical field. Not a failure of communication, but the opposite, an overload. 17 experienced military minds all simultaneously receiving the same input and all simultaneously producing the same output. Something is here that I cannot read, and I do not know what it is, and it has been watching me. The formation broke. Not in panic, these were professionals, but in the specific way that a formation breaks when the terrain has changed in a way the map did not predict. A ripple of repositioning that ate 4 seconds of time and produced enough visual gap in coverage that the second human operative, who had been in the ventilation access duct above the bay door for the previous 6 minutes thinking about absolutely nothing and maintaining a null state that the Keth tactical integration had been utterly unable to locate, dropped behind the rear guard. This was not a story about humans winning a battle through physical supremacy. The Keth Reformation operatives were larger, armed with weapons designed specifically for station environments, experienced and coordinated in a way that gave them a genuine tactical advantage in most circumstances. But most circumstances assumed that the enemy could be located. You cannot coordinate against a position you cannot find. You cannot target a mind you cannot read. The entire foundation of the Keth tactical system was real-time psionic location data, and for the first time in those operatives' careers, that system was returning nothing. Not an enemy signature, not a wrong signature, but the specific and uniquely terrifying return of a signal that said, "There is something here that has chosen to be invisible to you, and it knows exactly where you are." The first operative that Callahan secured went down quietly, from behind, with the specific efficiency of someone who had chosen his moment with the patience of a glacier. The second was Callahan's partner, Reyes, the language specialist who had spent 6 months reciting poetry and who had, in the emergency, simply stopped talking and become something that Miru's monitoring equipment registered as a null state, smaller magnitude than Callahan, but present. From the corridor junction, 2 seconds later, Osi took down the third from the communications room, where she had gone to re-establish the channel to Union Fleet, and had set her comm work in motion with the automatic part of her brain while the rest of her attention had gone to the door and stayed there. It took 11 minutes. The Keith tactical integration, which the operatives could not shut down any more than Callahan could shut down his psionic field, spent those 11 minutes registering the progressive attrition of its members through a series of location signals that winked out one by one, not in the way they would if each operative had simply died or been disabled, but in the specific way they would if each operative had been, for a moment before their signal vanished, terrified. The lead operative, who was the last one standing, made the rational decision to recall to the docking bay. She reached the bay door. She stopped. The bay was dark, and the psionic map of it still showed empty, and she knew, with the deep, bone-certain knowledge of a telepath who has learned what that particular quality of emptiness means, that it was not. She stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. Then she set down her weapon and put her hands up. Callahan materialized out of the shadow of the cargo transport, collected the weapon and said, because he was technically still on duty under the vocalization mandate, and had been extremely conscientious about compliance in the months leading up to this moment, "Thank you. I've got coffee in the security center if you want to wait somewhere more comfortable." The lead operative later, in her debrief with Union intelligence, would be asked to describe the moment. She thought about it for a long time before answering. "We were trained," she said, "to fight minds we could read, to position against the signal, to exploit the noise, to use the chaos of a thinking being against itself. We have done this against Velhari, against Ethon, against our own kind, in the secession. We are very good at it." She paused. "The humans gave us nothing to read. You cannot exploit a signal that isn't there. You cannot position against a mind that has decided it does not exist in the way you're looking for." Another pause. The station commander was terrified of their silence. I understand why now. But what she was frightened of was not danger. What she was frightened of was losing the advantage she did not know she had. The moment the humans went quiet, the telepathic species on that station lost something they had always taken for granted. They could no longer be the ones watching. The Union fleet arrived 47 minutes after the first shot and found 14 Keth Reformation vessels holding position at the outer marker, 23 of their boarding operatives in Union custody, in the station's security wing, the communication arrays damaged but beginning the process of emergency repair, and Commander Yara Osei on the command deck, running the station's defensive protocols with the station's senior staff, all of whom had stopped noticing, over the course of the crisis, that she had not spoken a single unnecessary word in the last hour. Miru had noticed. She had noticed everything from her monitoring station, and had kept her level 3 shielding up for the full duration, and had filed, in the 10 minutes between the boarding team's capture and the fleet's arrival, a preliminary incident report that she later expanded into the most read document in the Psionic Safety Division's history. The High Council convened again, not in full session this time, just the Diplomatic Crisis Committee, 7 members including Varanith, 3 days after the incident. The agenda was again one item, the matter of the Sol 3 species. This time the debate lasted 2 hours. Osei was invited to speak. Not to defend herself, there was nothing to defend. The Union's legal assessment had been completed and was entirely in the human delegation's favor. But because Varanith, who had been thinking for 3 days and was old enough to know when she needed a perspective her own mind could not produce, had asked her to, she stood at the council's address lectern, a position that no non-council member had ever occupied before, and spoke the way she always spoke, clearly, without hurry, in the particular cadence of someone who has learned that the most important thing about words is the space you leave around them. "I've read the vocalization mandate," she said. "All 400 pages. I understand what you were afraid of. I understand why you were afraid of it." She paused. I'm going to tell you what the silence actually is from the inside, and then you can decide what to do with it. She talked for 30 minutes. She talked about human evolution, 200,000 years of development in environments where the ability to think quietly, to go still, to become imperceptible to the things that wanted to eat you, was not a luxury, but a survival skill. She talked about the human relationship with interiority, the vast, private inner life that her species maintained, with a fierceness that even she, fully immersed in the diplomatic world of shared communication, had never fully unlearned. She talked about what it felt like from the inside to enter the focused state that the Union had classified as a null state. It's not emptiness. It's the opposite of emptiness. It's all of you, all at once, pointed at one thing. It's what happens when a human stops dividing their attention and gives every bit of it to the moment they're in. She looked at Varaneth. You called it a weapon, she said. And I understand why. From the outside, something that can't be read and can't be located and moves with complete intention and leaves no signal, I imagine that's frightening. I imagine it's the most frightening thing a telepathic species can encounter. A mind with no readout. A consciousness that's chosen not to be visible. She paused. But it's not a weapon. It's concentration. It's the thing that happens when a human is so completely engaged with a problem that the rest of them falls away. When we're at our most dangerous, we're also at our most present. And being fully present, for us, means being fully quiet. Council member Shara Lynn, the youngest member, who had made the argument 6 months ago that what they did with innocent harm said more about them than about the humans, spoke into the brief silence that followed. The mandate requires them to keep talking, she said. It was designed to prevent the null state. I know, Osei said. But the null state is what saved the station. I know, Osei said. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms are quiet when everyone in them is thinking the same thing at the same time and no one has yet decided to say it. Varaneth said it. The mandate was designed to protect us from human silence, she said. But human silence is what protected us. She was still for a long moment, 8 ancient eyes focused somewhere beyond the chamber walls, somewhere in the long perspective of 400 years that always informed her thinking. We made a law, she said, because we were frightened of something we didn't understand. We required a species to perform constant transparency because their natural state of concentration looked to our senses like a predator. And we were not wrong that it was frightening. We were wrong about what to do with that fear. Her gaze settled back on Osei. We should not have mandated speech. We should have mandated trust. The vocalization mandate was formally amended 4 weeks later. The new version retained the accommodation requirements. The protocols developed to help telepathic species manage proximity to the human ambient field, but removed the prohibition on the null state. In its place, a new framework, the partnership protocols, which required human operatives to signal when they were entering operational focus, and required telepathic colleagues to maintain appropriate shielding rather than require the humans to suppress a capability they had not chosen and could not truly give up. In the amendments accompanying documentation, someone, Miru suspected Shara Lynn, though she never confirmed it, had included a line from a human philosophical tradition that she had found in the Xenoanthropology archive. The quietest thing in nature is a predator who has decided you are not prey. Learn to tell the difference. Callahan, when Osei told him the mandate had been amended, was in the security center drinking coffee. He set down the cup. So I don't have to narrate anymore? You don't have to narrate anymore. He was quiet for a long moment. A real quiet, the Callahan quiet. The one that Miru, who was technically off duty but had stopped by with a cultural exchange query that was at least partially an excuse, felt as the particular focused warmth of a man settling into his own mind with the satisfaction of coming home. Good, he said. Then, after a pause, I'll miss talking about the coffee, though. Miru's monitoring equipment registered briefly, a small null state, and then the ambient warmth of a human being slightly amused, and then the even comfortable noise of a mind at rest. She filed her last incident report on the matter with a summary that read, in its entirety, the Sol 3 species generates, in their natural state, a psionic ambient field that remains, by clinical measure, disruptive. In their focused state, they generate a void that remains, by clinical measure, alarming. Neither of these things is, by any meaningful measure, dangerous to us, provided we understand what we are encountering. We are encountering beings who spent 200,000 years learning that the most important thing about consciousness is knowing when to show it and when to hold it back. Beings who built civilization on the gap between the inside of a mind and the outside of a face. Beings who are, in their own internal experience, the noisiest creatures who ever lived, and who can, when they need to, become so quiet that the universe forgets they're there. This is not a hazard. This is extraordinary. I recommend full membership ratification. I recommend long-term cross-species psionic exchange programs. And I recommend, with the greatest possible professional sincerity, that when a human goes quiet, truly, fully, deliberately quiet, the rest of us stop and pay attention. Because they have decided something matters, and they are almost certainly right. Thank you for listening. Nova Archive, where the strangest thing in the universe is always us. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs reminding that the most dangerous thing about humanity has never been how loud we are. See you in the next one.